Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It started like any other job, with a knock on the door at an ungodly hour. I rolled out of bed, groggy and half-dressed, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes as I staggered to the door. You'd think, after 10 years in this line of work, I'd be used to it by now, but I wasn't. A man can't really get used to hunting down monsters for a living. It's just something you learn to tolerate, like bad coffee or cold showers. I swung the door open to find Clark standing there, his usually impassive face drawn into a tight line. Clark was a big guy, ex-military, the kind of man who spoke in monosyllables and let his fists do most of the talking. If he was at my door at this hour, it was something serious. "Got a situation," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "We're needed in Oregon." "Oregon?" I rubbed my stubbled chin. "What the hell is in Oregon?" "Trouble," Clark replied, not one for elaboration. "There's been a string of disappearances in the Cascade Mountains. People going missing on well-traveled trails. A ranger has been found torn to shreds." "Torn to shreds?" I echoed. "By what?" "That's what we need to find out." I sighed, running a hand through my unruly hair. The last time we had dealt with something in the wilderness, it hadn't ended well. But that was the job. You didn't get to pick the assignments. You just did them. Clark turned on his heel and headed back to the black SUV idling in my driveway. I grabbed my duffel bag, hastily threw in some gear, and followed him out. We were wheels up within the hour, the darkened streets of Los Angeles quickly fading as we headed north. The early morning silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional grunt from Clark. We arrived in Oregon just as dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the thick canopy of the Cascades. The air was cool and crisp, a far cry from the smoggy heat of LA. I breathed it in, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. A local ranger named Dean was waiting for us at the trailhead, a weathered man in his 50s with a face that had seen too much. He looked at us with a mixture of relief and skepticism. "You guys are the experts?" Dean asked, eyeing our gear. "Something like that," Clark replied curtly. "What's the situation?" Dean led us to the ranger station, where a map of the area was spread out on a table. "5 hikers have gone missing in the past 2 weeks," he said, pointing to various spots on the map. "All of them were experienced, knew the area well. Last one was a ranger, good kid. We found what was left of him 3 days ago." Dean swallowed hard. Whatever it wasn't a bear or a cougar. No animal does that kind of damage. Clark leaned over the map, his eyes narrowing. "Where's the body?" Dean hesitated. "I've got it in cold storage. Wasn't sure what else to do with it." "The sheriff—" "Well, he's out of his depth on this one." "Show us," Clark ordered. Dean led us to a small outbuilding behind the station. The stench hit me as soon as the door opened, a sickly sweet smell that turned my stomach. Inside, a metal table held what was left of the ranger. I'd seen plenty of mangled bodies in my time, but this was something else. The kid was barely recognizable, his torso ripped open, bones shattered, flesh shredded like it had gone through a meat grinder. But it wasn't the brutality that got to me. It was the precision. Whatever had done this had known exactly where to strike, how to kill with maximum efficiency. "Jesus," I muttered, turning away. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Clark didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the body. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Not sure yet, but it's not human." I didn't need him to tell me that. I'd seen enough in this job to know when we were up against something unnatural, something that didn't belong in our world. Dean looked like he was about to be sick. "You think it's some kind of animal?" "No," Clark said flatly. "Not an animal." That didn't leave many options. I exchanged a glance with Clark. He nodded, and I knew we were on the same page. Whatever this was, it wasn't something that could be explained away as a simple predator attack. This was something from the other side, something we were specifically trained to deal with. "We'll need to set up a perimeter," Clark said, snapping back into mission mode. "I want cameras, sensors, the works. We're going to find whatever did this and put it down." Dean just nodded, too shell-shocked to argue. He led us back to the main building where we set up our gear. Clark was a master of logistics, and within an hour, we had the area wired up like a fortress. I set up the cameras, infrared sensors, and motion detectors, while Clark reviewed the footage from the past few days, searching for any sign of our quarry. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, a heavy silence settled over the station, the kind that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. I could sense the tension in the air, the weight of something lurking just out of sight. "We've got company," Clark muttered, staring at one of the monitors. I moved to his side, my eyes scanning the screen. There, in the upper corner, something moved. Too fast to make out clearly, but definitely there. It was large, bigger than any animal that should have been in these woods, and it moved with a purpose, like it knew exactly where we were. "Get ready," Clark said, reaching for his rifle. I did the same, checking the chamber, making sure everything was locked and loaded. The night deepened, the forest swallowing the last of the daylight. We huddled in the station, the only sound the low hum of the monitors and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the stillness. Then it hit. A thunderous crash against the side of the building that rattled the windows and sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. Clark was on his feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. "Stay close," he barked, moving toward the door. I followed, my grip tight on the weapon. We stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. And then I saw it. A shadow, massive and hunched, slinking through the trees. Clark fired, the shot echoing through the woods. The creature barely flinched, its movements quick and calculated. It darted from tree to tree, never staying in one place long enough for us to get a good look. I fired a burst, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the night. The thing let out a noise, not a scream, not a howl, but something in between, something that made my skin crawl. And then it charged. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, closing the distance in seconds. I barely had time to react before it was on me, a blur of claws and teeth. Clark yelled something, but I couldn't hear him over the blood rushing in my ears. I fired blindly, desperately, as the creature lunged. But it didn't go for me. It went for Clark, knocking him to the ground with a force that left me breathless. I scrambled to my feet, raising my rifle, but Clark was already on his back, wrestling with the thing. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Half wolf, half bear, with a face that was almost human in its hatred. Clark roared, slamming the butt of his rifle into its head. The creature snarled, blood spraying from its maw as it snapped at his throat. I moved forward, the world narrowing to the space between me and Clark, me and the monster trying to tear him apart. I took aim, breathing steady, and fired. The bullet found its mark, striking the creature in the side. It reared back, a guttural noise ripping from its throat. No, not guttural. Something worse, something primal and ancient. Clark shoved it off him, scrambling back as I fired again. The creature staggered, blood dripping from its wounds. But it wasn't done. It looked at me, eyes filled with a malevolence that was almost human. I fired again, and this time the bullet caught it square in the chest. It fell, finally, a heavy thud against the earth. Clark and I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body. I'd seen a lot of things in my time, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so wrong. "It's dead," I said, more to myself than to Clark. "Yeah," Clark replied, his voice flat. "It's dead." We didn't linger. We didn't talk about what had happened or what that thing was. We did our job, securing the area, making sure the creature was really down. It was. Its body was still there, cold and heavy, a testament to the fact that this was real. As we packed up to leave, Dean approached, his face pale and drawn. "What was that thing?" "Don't know," Clark replied. "Don't care. It's over." Dean nodded, though the fear in his eyes remained. I didn't blame him. It wasn't something you just shook off. But for us, it was just another day on the job. We loaded the body into the SUV, making sure to seal it tight. Clark drove in silence, the road stretching out before us like a black ribbon. We didn't need to talk. We'd done what we came to do. As we pulled away from the Cascade Mountains, the last remnants of night fading in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but think that there would always be another monster, another hunt. But for now at least, we'd won. We drove on, leaving the horrors behind us for now. In 1991, I found myself walking through the dense forest of New Hampshire's White Mountains. My name is Nolan Littlefeather, and if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be crawling through the woods in the dead of night, hunting for something that had already killed 3 people, I'd have laughed. But here I was, gripping a flashlight in one hand and a machete in the other, because apparently the creatures out here don't much care for polite handshakes. It started 2 weeks ago when the first body was found. A hiker mid-30s found torn apart just off the Appalachian Trail. The authorities thought it was a wild animal, maybe a cougar or wolf, but the way the body was mutilated didn't sit right with the local rangers. I was in town for some peace and quiet after quitting my job in Boston. You know, trying to find myself in the wilderness, because a good existential crisis is always better when surrounded by pine trees and bears, right? I wasn't armed at the time because I figured all I'd need was my wits and maybe some granola. That was until I met Brian. Brian was the local park ranger who had a strange way of dealing with everything with a grin and a sarcastic comment, no matter how serious the situation. You could tell the guy had seen some things. He'd invited me to a search party after the second hiker went missing. Said he liked having someone around who knew the woods as well as I did, given my heritage. I'm Cherokee, and growing up I spent a lot of time learning the old ways, tracking, hunting, staying quiet. I guess I underestimated how much that knowledge would come back to bite me, literally. We started the search at dawn, and by noon we found the second body. The poor bastard was a mess, his torso shredded like someone took a cheese grater to it. No one said much, but the way the blood was smeared across the rocks, it looked too deliberate, too human. There were no animal tracks, no sign of struggle, just blood and pieces of him scattered like someone was trying to make art. And hey, I'm all for creativity, but this was taking it a little too far. Brian made some joke about it being another White Mountain special, trying to lighten the mood. I forced a chuckle, but inside I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some unlucky hiker falling prey to the local wildlife. After that, everything started spiraling. Search parties were doubled, the media got involved, and the small town of Bartlett started to feel more like a ghost town as tourists packed up and left. Can't blame them. The third hiker vanished 2 days later. Her body was never found, just pieces of her camping gear and a tent slashed to ribbons. At this point, people started talking. The whispers in town weren't about wolves or bears anymore. They were about something else, something that didn't belong in these woods. And I got curious, as one does when they have a death wish and too much free time. By the time the park rangers were locking down the trails, I'd already made up my mind. I didn't know what it was, but I was going to find it. Call it stupidity or bravery, but I've always been too stubborn for my own good. Brian thought I was nuts. Nolan, I don't know what you think you're going to find, but if 3 people can't make it out of those woods alive, what makes you think you will? He asked, his grin faltering for the first time since I'd met him. I just shrugged and told him someone had to figure out what was going on, and it might as well be me. Of course, I didn't mention that I had no intention of becoming the 4th victim. He laughed at that, but his eyes told me something else. There was fear there. Fear he couldn't joke away this time. I set out at dusk, machete in hand. I figured if whatever was out there was tearing through tents like tissue paper, I'd at least stand a chance if I had something sharp, and if not, well, at least I'd go out swinging. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter everything became. It wasn't just the usual silence of nature at night. This was something else, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I've never been religious, but at that moment I could almost feel something watching me. Not that I'm one to give in to paranoia, most of the time anyway. Around midnight I found the campsite where the 3rd hiker had been last seen. The area was still cordoned off, but it looked like the rangers had missed something. There were deep grooves in the ground, like something had been dragged away. I followed the marks for about 20 feet before they stopped abruptly. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing. It was as if the woman had just been lifted off the ground and carried away. I pressed on, flashlight barely piercing the darkness, every step more hesitant than the last. I'll admit there were moments when I questioned why I was doing this. But then I'd remember the look on Brian's face, the fear in his voice when he talked about the missing hikers. He was scared, and Brian never got scared. If there was something out here, I was going to find it. I stumbled on the cave purely by accident. Hidden behind a thicket of trees and boulders, it was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, it reeked of death. Rotting meat, coppery blood, and something else, something I couldn't place but that made my stomach churn. My flashlight beam flickered as I moved deeper into the cave, and for a second I thought I was seeing things. At the far end of the cave there were bones, not just animal bones, but human ones too, piled high like some twisted trophy collection. I counted 3 skulls before I stopped looking. The walls of the cave were smeared with dark stains, and at the center I saw it, an altar. Stone carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize, and standing on it, a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't a bear or a wolf, or anything natural. It was hunched over, covered in matted fur that looked more like rotting skin than anything living. Its back arched unnaturally like a grotesque parody of a man. But it wasn't the fur or the stench that froze me in place. It was the mouth. It didn't have fangs like you'd expect from a predator. No, its mouth was lined with what looked like human teeth. Crooked and jagged, too many to count, all crammed together in a grin that would have been comical if it wasn't so horrifying. I stood there, too shocked to move, too scared to breathe. It didn't notice me at first, too focused on whatever it was doing. But then the flashlight flickered again, and that's when it turned. Its neck cracked as it twisted to look at me, and for a split second I thought I was dead. But it didn't charge. It didn't attack. It just stared, those teeth clacking together as if it was trying to decide what to do with me. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and bolted out of that cave, running faster than I ever had in my life. My heart was pounding in my ears, my legs burning, but I didn't stop until I hit the trailhead, panting and drenched in sweat. Brian was there when I got back. He took one look at me and knew. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded, too shaken to speak. The next morning, I told the authorities everything. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? But they couldn't ignore the cave. When they went to investigate, it was gone. Collapsed in on itself, or so they said. Convenient, right? But they found the bones. That part they couldn't explain away. 3 skulls and enough bones to account for 3 missing hikers. They closed off the entire section of the forest after that. No one's allowed in anymore. Officially, it's due to dangerous wildlife, but we know better. Brian and I don't talk about it much, but every now and then he'll crack a joke about going on another White Mountain special. We both laugh, but it's a nervous laugh, the kind that never quite reaches your eyes. I've been back to the area a few times, but I don't go near the trailhead anymore. Call it self-preservation. Or maybe I just don't feel like becoming a skull in some collapsed cave. Either way, I think I'll stick to city parks from now on. After all, the worst thing you'll run into there is a squirrel with an attitude. There's something about working in a small town that keeps you humble. Not because the job's easy, but because you're always the one who gets called when people can't deal with the worst of it themselves. I'm Ray Franklin, and I've been doing this job for, well, it feels like forever. But let's just say long enough to know when something doesn't sit right. This was back in 2003, and I was the only officer in Holbrook, a town no bigger than the football field back in my old high school. When I tell people that I prefer being the only cop in a one-stoplight town, they look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but small-town work suits me. I know the folks, They know me. And when things go sideways, I'm the one they call. Whether it's a fight over the last bottle of cheap whiskey at the gas station or someone losing a goat to a loose dog. But this was different. Holbrook isn't a place you'd hear about unless you were lost. It's deep in the woods, just north of the Ozarks. If you stand in the middle of Main Street, all you'd see is a gas station that's been out of order for a decade. The diner run by old Miss Caroline and a cluster of houses clinging to the side of the hill like they're waiting for the next big storm to take them. It's the kind of place where folks keep to themselves, not because they're unfriendly, but because it's just the way it's always been. That night I was patrolling the edge of town as I usually did before heading in. It was quiet, just the way I liked it, and I had my window rolled down, enjoying the cool breeze. Nothing felt off, nothing seemed unusual, until I got the call. Miss Caroline's voice crackled through the radio. "Ray, you out there?" I grabbed the receiver. "Always, Caroline, what's up?" "There's something strange over by the old Miller place. You mind checking it out?" "Strange how?" She hesitated. "I don't know, just strange. Hank said he saw something moving through the trees, big. Said it didn't look like any animal he's seen before. Now, Hank wasn't one to jump at shadows. The man had been hunting these woods since he could hold a rifle. So when he said something was out of place, I took it seriously. "All right, I'm on my way." The Miller place was about 10 miles out, down a winding road that most folks avoided. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and even the local kids didn't dare go out there after the sun set. Not that I believed in any of those old ghost stories, but the place did have a way of getting under your skin. I pulled up to the edge of the property and killed the engine. It was quiet. Too quiet. The wind had died, and even the crickets seemed to have taken the night off. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel, and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, and I scanned the edge of the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound, just the rustling of the leaves overhead. I started walking toward the house, keeping my light low. My hand was on the grip of my sidearm, not because I was expecting trouble, but because the stillness felt wrong. If there's one thing I've learned in this job, it's that you don't second-guess your gut. That's when I heard it. A snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, but heavier. Something large was moving through the brush, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I swung the beam in that direction, but there was nothing. Just trees swaying gently in the dark. I kept walking, slower now, my heart starting to thud in my chest. I'm not one to scare easy, but this was different. Something wasn't right. Another crack, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Hank, that you?" No answer. I took a few more steps toward the sound, my flashlight catching the edge of something shiny in the dirt. Kneeling down, I brushed away the leaves and found a torn piece of fabric. Looked like it had been ripped from a shirt. There were dark stains on it, stains that didn't need a lab to confirm what they were. Blood. "Jesus," I muttered, standing up, my hand instinctively going to the holster on my hip. Another sound, this time to my right, faster, moving through the underbrush like something big and clumsy. But what got me was the smell. It hit me all at once, like something had crawled out of the earth and died weeks ago. I've smelled bad things before. Hell, I've even dealt with a couple of bodies that had been out in the sun too long. But this was something else entirely. I turned toward the sound, squinting into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear, big, hulking, moving on all fours. But as it got closer, I could see the shape was all wrong. Too long, too lean, with legs that bent the wrong way, like it had been pieced together from different animals. The skin was stretched tight, almost translucent, and its mouth hung open, revealing teeth, more teeth than anything should have. I didn't wait. I pulled my gun and fired. Once, twice. The sound echoed through the trees, but the thing didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. I backed up, my hand shaking as I tried to reload, but the thing was faster than it looked. It lunged forward, and I felt something slam into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs and sending me sprawling backward. I hit the ground hard, my head swimming as I struggled to get my bearings. The flashlight had rolled out of my hand, casting a weak beam across the dirt, and in that dim light I saw it standing over me. It made a noise, something low and deep that vibrated through my bones. I've never heard anything like it. Not from any animal in these woods, and sure as hell not from anything man-made. For a second, I thought I was done for. But then there was a shout. Hank's voice, cutting through the noise, and a gunshot. The thing jerked, staggering back, and Hank appeared out of the trees, rifle in hand. "Get up!" he shouted, firing again. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and stumbling toward Hank as he fired another shot. The thing let out a sound that could only be described as a scream, high-pitched and almost human. And then it turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. For a few moments, neither of us moved. We just stood there listening to the thing crash through the underbrush until the sounds faded away. Hank lowered his rifle, breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But it wasn't anything from around here." We didn't stick around to find out if it was coming back. By the time we made it back to town, it was well past midnight, and neither of us spoke a word on the drive. I filed my report the next day, kept it simple, no need to mention the thing we saw. Just said there was some kind of animal attack, that we'd scared it off. But between you and me, Hank and I both knew it wasn't any kind of animal we'd ever seen. Folks around here have their stories, legends, really. They say there's things out in the woods, things that have been here long before any of us, things that shouldn't be disturbed. Maybe that's true, or maybe we just got unlucky that night. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was 2010 when I decided I'd had enough of the grid. The constant hum of city life, the noise, the bills, the endless small talk with neighbors I didn't like. I wanted out. So I packed up and moved to the middle of nowhere, which in my case happened to be in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Name's Wyatt Callahan. I didn't tell anyone about my plans. I didn't owe anyone anything, and to be honest, the idea of explaining myself to people I'd barely tolerated seemed like the last waste of energy I'd spend on the grid. Now, I wasn't always a hermit. I've got a background in electrical work, ironic, right? Spent over a decade wiring up office buildings, homes, the usual. But the moment I got fed up with all the buzzing and beeping, I used my own skills to turn off the world. I built my own cabin, installed solar panels, rainwater collection, all that self-sufficient jazz. It was peaceful, and for a while, I was convinced I'd never need to deal with people again. Let me clarify something real quick. Going off the grid doesn't mean cutting yourself off from reality. Sure, I was in the sticks, but I knew what was going on in the world. I still made the occasional trip into town, had a sat phone in case of emergencies, and checked the weather on an old portable radio. What I didn't count on, though, was that emergencies in the mountains didn't always fit the kind you prepare for. I first noticed something was wrong when I found deer carcasses around the perimeter of my land. I'm no stranger to wildlife. Mountain lions, bears, coyotes, they're all around these parts. But the way these animals were torn apart wasn't right. Limbs scattered, chunks missing, but no signs of scavenging, no claw marks, nothing that made sense. If anything, it looked like someone, or something, had been picking at them like a bored kid at a dinner table. It was after the third mutilated deer that I started setting traps around the property. Now, before you think I was being paranoid, let me remind you that isolation makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. You notice the smallest changes. A broken branch, tracks where there shouldn't be any. Something was lurking, and I wasn't about to let it get too close without knowing what it was. 2 nights later, the traps went off. Not just one, 3 at once. It was about 3 a.m. when I heard the snapping of metal and wood, followed by a low, dragging noise. Grabbing my rifle, I moved toward the sound, careful to avoid stepping on the branches I had laid out as an early warning system. My boots were silent on the damp earth, but that noise, the dragging, was constant. The kind of sound that makes you grit your teeth. I finally got close enough to one of the traps to shine my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. I've seen coyotes, wolves, mountain lions. Hell, I even once had a face-to-face encounter with a grizzly. But this thing was none of those. At first glance, you'd think it was a wolf if wolves were 8 feet long, had limbs too thin for their bodies, and skin so tight it looked like it would rip apart any second. Its fur, if you could call it that, was matted, patches missing, and where they were gone, the skin underneath was black and leathery, like old tar. I don't know why I didn't shoot it right then and there. I was frozen, staring at it as it dragged one of the traps, which had caught its hind leg. But here's the part that really freaked me out. It wasn't trying to get away. It wasn't thrashing, wasn't whimpering like any wounded animal. It just looked at me. No, through me. Its head jerked slightly, its jaw unhinged just a little, and I swear I heard something snap in the air like it was tasting it, like it could smell the fear I was trying to bury. Now, I've been called a lot of things, but dumb isn't one of them. I didn't wait for it to make the first move. I fired at its chest, and it staggered back, but not before letting out this sound. It wasn't a roar or anything natural. It was like every bad feeling you've ever had in your life turned into noise, and it made my bones feel brittle. The thing stumbled, and I bolted back toward the cabin, knowing full well it wasn't dead. When you live off the grid, you get used to handling things on your own. But this wasn't something I could handle. I tried getting to the sat phone, but the second I reached the door, I heard it again, closer. My traps hadn't slowed it down. If anything, it seemed like it was playing with me, letting me think I had a chance to call for help. I heard the scratching next. Long, deliberate drags of claws, or something like claws, along the side of my cabin. You ever hear something that just doesn't belong in nature? Like nails on a chalkboard, but worse? That's what it sounded like. And then it stopped. I was standing there, phone in hand, rifle ready, and nothing. Not a sound. The silence was suffocating. Then the door caved in. It didn't burst open. It caved, like something had pushed through it effortlessly. And there it was, dragging its hind leg behind it. That damn trap still caught in a mess of sinew where its foot should have been. It was bigger inside the cabin, towering over me as it slowly stepped forward, sniffing at the air, tasting it. I shot again, right into its face this time. It jerked back, black ichor spilling from the wound. But it didn't stop. It lunged at me, quicker than something that size had any right to move. The rifle was knocked out of my hands, and I barely managed to roll out of the way as it came crashing down where I'd been standing. Now here's where things get weird. I scrambled for the nearest thing I could grab, which happened to be an axe I kept by the fireplace. As I swung it, the thing reared back, making this awful rattling sound, and I managed to sink the axe deep into its chest. But instead of going down, it laughed. I kid you not. It made a noise that was too close to a human laugh, too mocking, like it understood the futility of what I'd just done. But I wasn't done. I yanked the axe out and swung again, this time hitting its neck, and the thing finally crumpled. I didn't stop swinging until its head was severed from its body. The black goo that oozed from it soaked into the floor, staining the wood, but I didn't care. I was just relieved it wasn't moving anymore. That relief didn't last. The thing's head, even separated from its body, twitched. Its mouth opened and a long, slow exhale escaped it, like a last breath. The stench was unbearable. But more than that, it spoke volumes of something I didn't want to think about. This thing hadn't been alone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door with the rifle in my lap, waiting for something else to come. But the hours passed and nothing did. The next morning I dragged what was left of it outside and buried it. Deep. Far away from the cabin. I wasn't about to let anyone, or anything, find it. I packed up after that, too. Got back on the grid. There are just some things out here you can't prepare for, no matter how off the grid you think you are. I've always been the kind of guy who likes to plan things out. Some might call me a control freak. I prefer organized. My wife, Erica, used to laugh about how I'd packed the car for trips days before we left. So when I got the idea to go on a solo road trip after she passed, it felt like the only way I could breathe again. That was 1997. The year everything in my life changed. Erica's death came out of nowhere. A car accident, sudden, brutal. She was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, I was standing in the rain at her graveside, wondering what had happened to my world. It felt like I was driving through a fog after that, trying to make sense of things, but nothing added up. So a month after the funeral, I left. Packed my Chevy Blazer and drove north from Seattle with no real plan other than to just keep going until the numbness wore off. I told myself it would help, clear my head. It didn't. But it did get me off the couch. By the time I hit Montana, the sky stretched wide and open like the landscape was daring me to keep going. And I did. Driving felt like the only thing that made sense. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, mostly because I didn't know. It wasn't like anyone was waiting for me back home anyway. Erica was gone. That day, I ended up on some back roads in Glacier National Park. The paved road turned to gravel, then dirt, but I wasn't paying much attention. I liked being alone, or at least I thought I did. I had a map in the glove box, but I hadn't touched it since I crossed the border into Montana. I didn't realize how far off course I'd gone until I saw the sign. No services beyond this point. It was barely hanging on a rusted metal pole, faded by years of neglect. I glanced at the fuel gauge, half a tank. I figured I could keep going for a bit. I wasn't in any rush to get anywhere. No one was expecting me. The gravel crunched under the tires as I made a right turn, just following the road as it wound deeper into the forest. It's strange. You don't realize how quiet things are until you're somewhere like that. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the engine and the wind rustling through the trees. After another mile or two, even the road started to disappear, narrowing until it was barely more than a trail. I don't know what made me keep driving. Maybe I just didn't care. Maybe I was looking for something to distract me from the constant loop of loss that was playing in my head. That's when I saw the cabin. It sat back off the trail, nestled between thick clusters of pine. The kind of place you'd only find if you were lost. I'd been driving for hours and hadn't seen another soul, so I figured it might be abandoned. Just a relic from some forgotten time when people still lived way out here. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed against it. I parked the Blazer, killing the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled different there, like damp wood and something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity got the better of me, I guess. I walked up to the cabin, calling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" No answer. I pushed the door open. The inside was as rough as you'd expect. Dusty shelves, a rotting table, a bed frame with no mattress. What caught my eye, though, was the smell. It hit me as soon as I stepped inside, like something had died. Old, stale, and rotten. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and turned to leave. But that's when I heard it. A scraping sound. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. My first thought was maybe it was an animal, something trapped. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded deliberate. I stepped back into the room, peering down the hallway that led to the back of the cabin. The noise came again, this time louder. Then, something moved. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, just a dark shape shifting in the corner of the room. My heart started to pound. I don't know why I didn't just leave right then. Maybe it was the part of me that always needed to know what was happening. But I wish I had left. I wish I had turned around, gotten back in my car, and driven as far from that place as I could. Because what I saw next... Two figures emerged from the shadows, hunched, almost crawling. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like their limbs didn't fit right in their bodies. They were covered in filth, their clothes nothing more than rags, skin pale and scarred. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but the one thing I noticed, the thing that stood out, was the smell. That same rotting stench that had filled the cabin. I backed up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My boot scraped against the floor, and that was all it took. One of them snapped its head toward me. Then they both stood up. Tall, too tall. I bolted for the door. Behind me, I could hear their feet slapping against the wood as they chased after me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel them gaining on me. I stumbled down the porch steps, nearly twisting my ankle as I ran for the blazer. My hands fumbled with the keys as I yanked the door open. They were closer now. I could hear them breathing, their footsteps pounding the dirt. I slammed the door shut just as one of them lunged at the window, hitting it with a sickening thud. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. I hit the gas, tires spinning in the dirt as I tore away from the cabin. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles down the road, but even then, I couldn't shake the image of those things. Those people, or whatever they were. I kept driving, not even caring where I was headed. I just wanted to get as far from that place as possible. Eventually, I reached a small town, a gas station with a flickering neon sign. I pulled in, the engine sputtering as I turned it off. My hands were still shaking as I climbed out of the car. The attendant, an older guy with a thick mustache, glanced up from his magazine. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing me like I'd just seen a ghost. I don't know," I stammered. "I think there's something out there. Something in the woods." The guy frowned, then let out a low chuckle. "You ain't the first to say that. A lot of folks go missing around here, especially tourists. They get lost in those back roads, never come back." "What do you mean?" I asked, my mouth dry. He leaned in closer. "I mean, you're lucky you got out. Some people ain't so lucky." I stared at the man, my pulse still hammering in my throat. His words rattled in my head. "Some people ain't so lucky." He didn't seem surprised by what I'd said, almost like he'd heard it before. Too many times. "What do you mean people go missing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man shrugged, looking down at the counter as if the question bored him. "Glacier's a big place. People think they know where they're going, but once you're off the main roads, you can get lost real fast. Or worse, you end up someplace you weren't supposed to be." I opened my mouth to ask more, but something about his tone stopped me. It was casual, but there was an edge to it, like he knew more than he was saying. He glanced up at me, his eyes narrowing. "You from around here?" I shook my head. "Seattle." "Figures," he said, reaching for the gas pump and hooking it into my car. "City folks always think they can handle these roads." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "Who are they?" I blurted, my voice sharper than I intended. His hand paused mid-motion. He looked up at me, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Who are who?" "The people out there," I said, lowering my voice. "In the woods. They chased me." He stared at me for a long moment, then let out a slow sigh. "Best you forget about that, son. Some things are better left alone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy knew something. Maybe more than he was letting on. But he wasn't going to tell me. I could see it in his face. He'd made peace with whatever secrets those woods held, and he wasn't about to share them with some outsider like me. The gas pump clicked off, and he pulled the nozzle free, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "If you're smart, you'll get yourself back to where you came from. Ain't nothing out here for you." I wanted to press him, to ask him more, but the way he looked at me, like I was some kind of fool, made me bite my tongue. Instead, I paid for the gas and got back into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The man watched me through the window as I pulled out of the station, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving with more questions than answers. Something about the way he spoke, the way he dismissed my fear, it gnawed at me. It was like he knew I'd seen something real, but he wasn't going to tell me why. I drove through the night, the headlights carving a path through the darkness as I retraced my way out of the park. The trees pressed in on either side, their shadows long and shifting in the glow of the beams. The further I got from that cabin, the more I wanted to believe it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd been so tired, so strung out from grief, that my mind had conjured up those things. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. When I finally reached a highway, the relief was palpable. Civilization, lights, other cars. I thought about pulling over, finding a hotel, but I couldn't stop moving. I just wanted to keep going, to put as much distance as I could between me and whatever I'd stumbled upon. But the drive didn't bring any peace. All I could think about was what I'd seen. The strange, twisted bodies, the way they moved, the smell of rot. And then, as if my mind wasn't tortured enough, I thought about what the gas station attendant had said. People go missing. I pulled into a rest stop somewhere near Kalispell, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The lot was nearly empty, just a couple of semis idling at the far end. I got out, stretched my legs, trying to shake the feeling that clung to me like a second skin. The rest stop was quiet, the kind of place where you could hear every creak, every rustle of the wind. I walked toward the vending machines, needing something to take my mind off things. Maybe a snack. Maybe anything. That's when I saw it. Taped to the glass of the vending machine was a flyer. I stepped closer, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the faces. Missing persons. A young couple, probably in their 20s. Their names were scrawled below their pictures. Marcy and Jason Phillips. The date, 2 months ago. I stared at their faces, a knot forming in my stomach. Something about them felt familiar, and I couldn't shake the sense that I'd seen them before. Maybe in a news report. Or maybe somewhere else. The memories of the cabin flashed in my mind. Could they have been there? Could they have fallen into the same nightmare I had? Suddenly, I couldn't stand being at the rest stop any longer. I tore my gaze from the flyer, stuffed my hands into my pockets, and hurried back to the car. The key fumbled in the ignition, but the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot like something was chasing me again. I drove for hours. I didn't know where I was going anymore. Somewhere, anywhere, just as long as it wasn't there. My thoughts raced, colliding with each other in a tangled mess. The cabin, the figures, the missing couple. That gas station attendant who had looked at me like I'd walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't until I saw the lights of a small town ahead that I realized how tired I was. Exhaustion weighed heavy on my limbs, my eyes burning from the strain of the road. I had to stop. I had no choice. I found a cheap motel just outside of town, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzed and flickered. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up as he handed me the key. Room 7. I stumbled inside, dropping my bags by the door before collapsing onto the bed. For a moment, I thought I might finally get some rest, and maybe I'd wake up and all of this would have been a bad dream. But as I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, my mind kept drifting back to that cabin. To those things. Who were they? I hadn't noticed it at first, but something had been gnawing at the back of my mind ever since I left. Something the gas station attendant had said. Some people go missing, he'd told me. But it wasn't just that. It was the way he'd said it. Like it was no big deal. Like it was something he saw all the time. Suddenly, I sat up, a cold realization washing over me. He had known. He had known all along. I grabbed the car keys and headed out into the night. I had to go back. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't leave it like this. The road stretched on in front of me, familiar but dark, leading back to the place I thought I'd never see again. The cabin, the answers, and something else. When I finally arrived, I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and followed the trail of the woods back toward the cabin. The air felt different now, heavier. And in that stillness, as I approached the door, I saw what I hadn't seen before, a rusted sign nailed to a tree near the edge of the cabin. It was almost completely faded, but I could make out the words, "Property of Phillips family." The names from the flyer hit me like a punch to the gut. Marcy and Jason, the young couple, this was their land. Before I could take another step, I heard something, a low scrape like nails on wood. I turned, but it was too late. The figures emerged from the darkness, moving toward me. This time they weren't alone. There were more of them. Too many. They surrounded me, their faces clearer now in the moonlight. Pale, deformed, eyes hollow. These weren't just strangers. They were the Phillips family. Every last one of them. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. The figures surrounding me, the hunched, malformed bodies, were all that was left of the Phillips family. Every detail from the missing persons flyer flashed in my mind, and it hit me like a freight train. These weren't strangers. They were the people who had vanished, their lives twisted and destroyed by something terrible that had happened on this land. They weren't human anymore, not in any way that mattered. Their clothes were rags, their faces scarred and disfigured beyond recognition. They moved with an eerie, jerking rhythm, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. But I knew. I knew they were still alive in some sense, still bound to this place, trapped in their own nightmare. The Phillips family. They had turned into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Whatever had twisted them into this state, it wasn't something I could fight. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand as I tried to make sense of it all. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Suddenly one of them, an older man, or what used to be a man, lunged forward, his arms outstretched. His mouth moved as if trying to form words, but no sound came out, just a dry rasp that sent shivers through my body. His face was inches from mine, the stench of decay filling the air between us. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my balance as I swung the flashlight in his direction. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. But they didn't stop. They kept coming, slow and deliberate, their dead eyes locked on me. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get out of there now. I turned and bolted toward the car, sprinting faster than I ever thought possible. I could hear them behind me, their feet scraping across the ground as they gave chase, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I fumbled with the keys as I reached the Blazer, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. The door finally unlocked and I dove inside, slamming it shut just as one of the figures reached the window. Their hands pounded on the glass, smearing it with dirt and filth. I turned the key in the ignition, praying it would start. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into gear and hit the gas, tearing away from the cabin as the figures faded into the darkness behind me. My hands gripped the wheel so tight I thought I might break it, but I didn't let up. I drove like a madman, the trees whipping past as I sped down the narrow road, away from that nightmare. For a long time I didn't stop. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but there was no logic to it. How could there be? The Phillips family, those poor people, they hadn't just vanished. They had become something else, something trapped in the forest, bound to that cabin, living in a twisted version of their former lives. Hours passed before I finally pulled over at another rest stop, this one closer to civilization. My hands were still trembling as I sat there staring blankly at the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell. Who would even believe me? I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That I'd been chased by people who shouldn't exist? That I'd seen the missing Phillips family twisted into some monstrous version of themselves? They'd lock me up, or worse, think I was trying to cover up some crime of my own. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes. I needed to get home. I needed to forget this ever happened. But as much as I wanted to, I knew I couldn't. The images of their deformed faces, their hands clawing at the car, were burned into my mind. The gas station attendant had known. That much was clear. He knew what happened to people who wandered too far off the beaten path, who stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to find. Maybe others in the town knew too. Maybe that's why they stayed quiet, why they didn't ask questions. They knew what happened to people like the Phillips family. And now, I did too. I started the car again, pulling out of the rest stop and merging onto the highway. The lights of the town faded in my rearview mirror, and soon I was alone on the road once more. The further I drove, the more distant the nightmare felt. But it never left me. Not really. For days I tried to push it out of my mind, but the memories kept resurfacing. The Phillips family, the cabin, the things they had become. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something I was missing. Why were they still there? Why hadn't anyone come for them? That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The flyer at the rest stop. It hadn't mentioned anyone coming to look for them. No search parties, No missing person reports beyond that single slip of paper taped to the vending machine. It was like they had been forgotten on purpose. Like no one wanted to find them. I still don't know what really happened to the Phillips family, or why that land twisted them into what they had become. But I know this. I wasn't supposed to see them. Whatever curse or madness had taken root in those woods, it had claimed them long ago. And I had barely escaped with my life. I never went back to Glacier National Park. I don't think I ever will. Some places are better left untouched, better left in the darkness where they belong. Because once you see what I saw, there's no going back. Not really. The road calls to me sometimes, like it did back then, pulling at me to leave, to wander. But I know better now. There are places out there you're not meant to find, and if you're unlucky enough to stumble upon them, they won't let you leave without a part of yourself staying behind. As for the Phillips family, I don't know what happened to them after that night. Maybe they're still out there, wandering the woods, looking for someone to take their place. But I'll never be the one to find out. The pine trees swayed with a nervous energy, whispering secrets to each other as if they knew something I didn't. It was 2003, deep in the heart of Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, where the quiet had a way of making a person feel small. I've always been the type to find solace in nature, the kind of guy who thought a weekend in the wilderness would clear my head. I'm Gideon Welker, a park ranger who traded a desk job for the great outdoors. It seemed like a good idea at the time, a fresh start from the corporate grind that had sucked my soul dry. A week into my shift, everything had been routine, checking trails, speaking to campers, and keeping an eye on the wildlife. The most exciting thing that had happened was a family of raccoons raiding a picnic site. I chuckled at the image of those little bandits. But all that changed when I came across a strange warning scrawled in the dirt near a popular hiking trail. Turn back or else. I brushed it off as some prank by bored teenagers. The only thing I had to worry about was keeping the bears away from the campsites, or so I thought. Little did I know that day would unravel into something unthinkable. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I made my way to the visitor center. I hoped to catch up with Lisa, my fellow ranger and the only person who could share a laugh about the raccoons. "Hey Lisa," I called as I walked in. The air was thick with the scent of brewing coffee. She was sitting behind the desk, surrounded by maps and brochures. "You ever seen a warning like this before?" I waved a dirt-covered stick in the air. Lisa looked up, eyebrows raised. "What warning?" I explained the message. Instead of laughter, her expression turned serious. "You might want to check with the locals. They know the area better than anyone." With a reluctant nod, I decided to take her advice. The local diner was the heart of the community, a place where gossip flowed as freely as coffee. As I entered, the familiar jingle of the door greeted me, and the smell of bacon hit me like a warm hug. The diner was buzzing, but it quieted down as soon as I stepped in. I approached the counter where a man named Earl, a hefty fellow with a beard as wild as the forest itself, stood flipping pancakes. "What's the word around here?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Earl paused, flipping a pancake with flair. "You ain't heard? Folks been saying there's something out there, something that don't belong." I snorted. "Like a bear that can't find its way home?" His eyes narrowed. "Nah, son. This is something different. They say it's not from around here, not like anything we know." Just as I was about to laugh it off, a woman in the corner, her face lined with worry, spoke up. "It's true. My husband went missing last week on that very trail you mentioned. He said he saw something strange." A chill crept up my spine. Strange? Like what? Something that didn't make sense. He didn't come back. The laughter I hoped to share with Lisa faded into a pit of unease. I thanked them for their input and left the diner, my mind racing. I had planned to dismiss the warning, but now I felt an odd sense of dread settling in. I decided to scout the area where I'd found the warning and see if I could find anything unusual. As I made my way through the winding paths, the forest around me shifted. The chirping of birds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It felt as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I pushed onward, determined to find something, anything, that could make sense of the warning. Just as I reached a small clearing, I caught a glimpse of something unusual. A flash of movement caught my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. My heart raced. Perhaps it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer startled by my presence. I scanned the area, trying to shake the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Then I heard it. A soft rustling behind me, almost like breathing. I spun around, adrenaline surging. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. I peered deeper into the underbrush, trying to decipher the source of the sound. Nothing, just shadows and branches. "Get a grip, Gideon," I muttered to myself. I turned to head back, but the rustling came again, closer this time. My instincts kicked in and I moved toward the noise, thinking perhaps it was a lost animal. I was trained to handle wildlife after all. I stepped carefully, each crunch of leaves beneath my boots echoing in the stillness. The rustling grew louder, more pronounced. As I approached a thick cluster of bushes, my heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and then I saw it. Emerging from the shadows was something that defied explanation. It stood on all fours, but its limbs were elongated, almost unnaturally so. The body was covered in matted fur, and its shape reminded me of a wolf, but with a hunched back and a twisted face that could only be described as grotesque. It paused, sniffing the air as if it had caught my scent. Every rational thought fled as panic surged through me. I reached for my radio, but my hand shook so badly that I couldn't get a grip. The creature locked onto my gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. I was frozen in place, caught in the web of its stare. The beast lunged. Instinct took over. I turned and ran, branches slashing at my face as I tore through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Every ounce of training urged me to stay calm, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the beast's breath behind me. Suddenly, I stumbled, hitting the ground hard. My radio flew out of my hands, skidding across the dirt. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sting of pain, and made a beeline for the trail, desperately hoping I could outpace it. I burst onto the main trail, gasping for breath. I had to reach the visitor center, alert others. I could hear it getting closer, the sound of its claws digging into the ground, gaining on me. As I sprinted down the path, I caught sight of the visitor center up ahead. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline fueling every step. I burst through the doors, slamming them behind me. "Lisa!" I shouted, frantically looking around the empty room. She rushed in from the back, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "What happened?" "There's something out there. A creature. It's..." Before I could finish, the door rattled violently. My heart dropped. "Did you lock it?" I asked, trying to control my voice. "I thought I did." She dashed to the door and shoved a heavy bench against it. I grabbed my radio, finally managing to get a grip on it. "We need to call for backup, now!" As I fumbled with the radio, the door buckled under the weight of the beast outside. Lisa and I exchanged a glance, fear pooling in our stomachs. Just then, the door burst open, flinging the bench aside like it was a toy. The creature stormed in, its twisted body lit by the dim light of the center. The stench of wet fur filled the air as it stepped inside, letting out a guttural sound that echoed off the walls. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand. We darted to the back exit, praying the creature wouldn't follow. We burst into the wilderness again, but there was no clear path. I led Lisa deeper into the woods, the beast's howls trailing behind us. My mind raced as I tried to remember the layout of the park. We needed to get to the nearest cabin, to barricade ourselves and wait for help. The trees closed in around us, each step heavy with dread. We moved as quietly as possible, the crunch of twigs beneath our feet sounding like thunder. I could hear the beast crashing through the underbrush, its growls echoing around us. Suddenly we came upon an old ranger cabin, its paint peeling and windows shattered. It looked abandoned, but we didn't have a choice. I pulled the door open and we stepped inside, slamming it shut behind us. The cabin was dark, the air stale. I fumbled for a light switch and found one. The bulb flickered to life, revealing a dusty room filled with old equipment. "Do you think it saw us?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe," I replied, scanning the room for something to barricade the door. As I pushed a table against it, I could hear the creature outside. its footsteps heavy against the wooden porch. I found a couple of old hunting rifles in the corner. They were dusty and rusty, but they could work. "Gideon," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it gets in?" I gritted my teeth, trying to block out the sound of the creature. "We'll handle it. Just stay quiet." With the rifles in hand, we positioned ourselves near the windows, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. My heart pounded in my chest as we listened to the creature's movements outside. After what felt like an eternity, the door rattled again, and I took aim. The door splintered as the beast charged forward. I squeezed the trigger, the blast echoing through the cabin. The creature let out a roar of pain and staggered back. "It hit it!" Lisa exclaimed, her eyes wide with shock. But it quickly recovered, more furious than before. It charged again, and this time the door flew off its hinges, sending wood splintering everywhere. The creature lunged at us. I fired again, hitting its side. It screeched, revealing teeth like a jagged shark's, glistening in the dim light. But instead of retreating, it pushed forward, slashing its claws toward us. The fight was chaotic. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I ducked and dodged, firing another shot. The cabin shook with each explosion, dust falling from the ceiling as the creature snarled and thrashed. In the chaos, I noticed something. Its movements were erratic, almost desperate. It wasn't just a predator, it was scared. "Gideon, it's coming for you," Lisa yelled, and I pivoted just in time to dodge another swipe of its claw. I realized this creature wasn't here to kill for sport. It was driven by something deeper, fear maybe, or a need to defend its territory. I had no idea what had happened to the previous hikers, but it felt like a misunderstood beast caught in a corner. I fired once more, hitting its leg. It stumbled, and I saw a moment of hesitation in its eyes. "Lisa, help me," I shouted, desperate to take control of the situation. She grabbed a chair and threw it at the creature, distracting it just long enough for me to approach. "Stay back," I yelled, trying to calm it. "Gideon, what are you doing?" Lisa cried. But I couldn't let it die. Not like this. I took a deep breath, standing my ground. "You don't want to hurt us. We're not your enemy." The creature paused, its breath heavy and labored. It eyed me cautiously, and I could sense its confusion. Just back away slowly," I whispered, moving my hands in a calming gesture. Lisa watched in horror, but I pressed on. "Let's just talk. You've been hurt, I can see that." For a heartbeat, it seemed to understand. It lowered its head slightly, panting. The tension in the room hung thick as we exchanged a silent understanding. Then, without warning, it lunged again, but this time, I was ready. I sidestepped and fired. The shot hit its shoulder and the beast yelped. It turned and ran back into the darkness, leaving us panting in the cabin. We stood in silence, the aftermath of the encounter settling in. I turned to Lisa, and we exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. When we finally made it back to the visitor center, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. I reported the encounter, and we set up a team to search the area. The search team found the creature's body later, mangled but intact, just a few yards from where I had first spotted it. The report that followed mentioned how it had been a previously undiscovered species now extinct. They thought it was a rogue animal, perhaps displaced from its natural habitat due to climate changes or hunting pressures. The town rallied around our story, a blend of awe and horror surrounding the creature. I became somewhat of a local legend, the ranger who faced the beast and lived to tell the tale. Lisa and I often laughed about the whole thing over coffee. The terrifying night transformed into a story we would share for years to come. As the seasons changed, so did the forest. The memory of that night lingered like a ghost, a reminder of the unpredictability of nature, the raw power of the wild that could both terrify and captivate. But life went on, and I returned to my daily duties, always keeping an eye on the woods, knowing full well that there were mysteries hidden in those trees that would never be fully understood. And that was okay too. Sometimes it's the unknown that keeps the world interesting. I never thought the sound of a branch snapping could change my life, but that's exactly how 1989 became the year I stopped believing I had everything figured out. My name's Colt Warwick, and back then I was living in a small forgotten town called Elberton, Georgia. Population? Barely enough to justify a single stoplight. You could say the place was perfect for someone like me, a guy who didn't much care for crowds or for the kind of people who thrived in them. I'd been here for about 5 years, and the woods surrounding Elberton had become my sanctuary. But sometimes even the safest places turn against you. I guess that's how it starts for everyone who finds themselves in a mess they didn't sign up for. One minute you're just trying to make it through another quiet day, and the next, you're knee-deep in something you'll wish you could forget. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to go hunting. The deer had been scarce lately, and I figured a little time in the forest might clear my head, give me something to bring back home. I wasn't one of those guys with fancy rifles and high-end gear. Nah, I had my old Winchester, some ammo, and a worn-out pair of boots that had seen better days. I didn't need much else. The trail I followed was one I'd walked 100 times before. It snaked through dense patches of oak and pine, past a dried-up creek and up into a ridge that overlooked the valley below. On any other day, it would have been peaceful. That day, though, it felt off. Maybe it was the silence, heavier than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you check your surroundings twice. At the time, I chalked it up to nerves. Hell, I'd been a bit on edge since the sheriff told me about the hiker that had gone missing last month. I'd heard rumors. Folks around Elberton said there was something unnatural in the woods. Some kind of creature lurking, but you hear that kind of stuff in every small town. I brushed it off, thinking it was the usual nonsense people spouted when they had too much time on their hands. People get bored, and when they do, they make up stories. But as I climbed the ridge, those old rumors started to creep back into my head. Halfway up, I stopped to take a breath, leaning against a tree and looking out over the valley. I didn't realize how dense the forest was until that moment, like the trees had closed in on me without my noticing. The wind picked up, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I couldn't hear a single bird. That's when I heard the branch snap. It wasn't far, maybe 20 yards behind me, just out of sight over the ridge's edge. Instinct kicked in, and I crouched low, clutching my rifle. I waited, ears straining for any sound that followed, but nothing came. Just more silence. Normally I wouldn't have given it a second thought. Could have been a deer or a raccoon for all I knew. But this time, something felt wrong. My gut told me not to ignore it, so I didn't. I turned, making my way slowly down the ridge, keeping low and quiet. When I reached the spot where I thought the sound had come from, I crouched behind a bush and waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just the breeze moving through the trees. Then, without warning, I smelled something foul. It hit me like a punch in the gut. A stench so thick and rotten that it made my eyes water. I'd been around plenty of dead animals before, but this was different. Like something had been left out to rot for weeks. I stayed crouched, breathing shallow, trying not to gag. When the smell faded, I stood up and took a cautious step forward. That's when I saw it. On the ground just a few feet ahead was the body of a deer. At first I thought it had been killed by a predator, maybe a bear. But as I got closer, I realized it was all wrong. The thing had been mauled, torn apart, but there was something unnatural about the way it had been done. Its limbs had been ripped clean off, not chewed or clawed at like you'd expect from an animal. It was like something had deliberately torn it apart, piece by piece. I backed up, my mind racing. Whatever did this wasn't just a predator looking for a meal. This was something different, something mean. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what it was. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound. Not a growl or a snarl, more like a deep, ragged exhale. It came from behind me, and every hair on my neck stood up. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there. Just trees, bushes, and shadows. But I knew deep down, something was watching me. I could feel it, the weight of eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I didn't wait to find out what was making that sound. I turned and started walking back the way I came, trying to stay calm, but my heart was hammering in my chest. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like the forest was pulling me in deeper. I picked up the pace, not running, but close to it. Then, the snapping of branches started again, closer this time. I didn't bother looking back. My gut told me to move faster, so I did. By the time I made it back to the ridge, I was practically jogging. The sun was starting to set and the light was fading fast. My heart raced, and I could hear it pounding in my ears. I kept moving, faster and faster, until I broke into a full sprint, the snapping of branches and that strange, heavy breathing right on my heels. I reached the edge of the woods, just in time to see something move out of the corner of my eye. Something big, something on two legs. It was standing there, just inside the tree line, watching me. I didn't stop to get a good look, but what I saw was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't human, not fully anyway. Its shape was all wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. And its face, it was wrong too, twisted and animalistic. I kept running, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. By the time I reached my truck, I was out of breath and shaking. I jumped in, slammed the door, and hit the gas, tearing out of there like my life depended on it, because it did. When I got back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I told him everything, the deer, the smell, the thing I'd seen in the woods. I expected him to laugh me out of his office, but he didn't. Instead, he listened, his face going pale as I spoke. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, staring at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're not the first to see it," he said, "but you might be the first to make it out alive." He told me there had been other disappearances in the area, other hunters who'd gone into those woods and never come back. They'd all gone missing near the same ridge I'd been on. And the thing that scared me the most... The sheriff didn't seem surprised. "Whatever's out there," he said, "it's been around for a while. Long enough for folks to know better than to go looking for it." I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing in the trees, watching me, waiting. But the sheriff was right. I made it out alive, and that was more than I could say for the others. They found more bodies a week later. 2 hikers, torn apart in the same way as the deer. No one in town said much about it. Maybe they didn't want to admit what we all knew, that something was out there, something that wasn't just a wild animal. I moved out of Elberton not long after that, packed up my truck and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I don't know if that thing is still out there, but I wasn't going to stick around and find out. And yeah, I gave up hunting after that. I figured the animals in those woods have enough to worry about without me adding to the mix. As for me, well, let's just say I'm sticking to places with a lot more concrete and a lot less trees.